Okay, so today we have a new digital humanities colloquium presentation, LLMs for Translation, Historical Text and Contemporary AI Models by Merve Tekgürler. Merve is a PhD candidate in history and master students in symbolic systems and currently a fellow at the Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence at Stanford. Merve has a BA degree in history and social and cultural anthropology from the Freie University in Berlin, and a master's in history from Stanford. So in 2022-23, Merve was a digital humanities graduate fellow at the Center for Spatial and Textual Analyses with a project on topic modeling on Ottoman court histories from the 18th and 19th centuries. That actually really sounds pretty cool. Merve is training a handwritten text recognition model for 18th century Ottoman Turkish administrative hand and developing AI-based natural language processing tools for Ottoman Turkish. The aim is to compile a large machine-readable corpus of manuscripts, news communiques, and employ computational text analysis methods. And I think this presentation is in line with that, right, Merve? Let me stop my
Yes, pretty much.
You can take over.
Yeah. Thank you so much for this generous introduction. I will share with you my slides, making sure it's the right thing I'm sharing. Can you all see the slideshow on the screen?
Yep, I can see the slide is now loading.
Oh, loading. Yes. I saw that 2 seconds ago too. Let's try this again. Hi.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I can see the slides now.
Hi. Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you, Menno, and thank you, Bento, for inviting me, for hosting me in this amazing colloquium. I'm really honored to be here. It is a little past midnight my time, so I will try to keep all of my wits in place to be a part of this community. And yeah, I'm looking forward to your feedback and the discussions. So the title of my presentation is Large Language Models for Translation. And subtitled Historical Text and Contemporary Ideas, or like Contemporary AI Models. I keep going back and forth between various subtitles. And the broad goal of my presentation is to actually talk about translation and machine translation and what it can and cannot do for us potentially in history, but like in broader fields. So my work on translation started pretty much with this quote by a former intern and a current research collaborator, Umar Patel at Stanford University. So after working months on 18th century Ottoman sources with me, trying to compile that corpus that you mentioned in my bio, Umar, who did not read Ottoman Turkish, we found this one manuscript that had an official English translation that was published by a scholar from Michigan. And when he was able to actually read an example of the kind of sources that he had been working on with me, it was as if there was a curtain between the text and the script up until that moment. So for me, as an Ottomanist, translation was like machine translation especially was never a prominent task until I actually understood what it can do for the students and for the communities that I'm interacting with. So in a way, translation for me, machine translation became a way to increase access to sources, increase access to materials from Ottoman history, which is particularly important because I teach at I'm a graduate student, but I also teach at a North American institution where the primary language of education is English. So without actually having access to English language historical sources, we cannot actually teach our own materials and teach our own research to our students. And this was sort of like the quest in starting translation. And while my particular project addresses this one aspect of translation and what translation can do, I want to underline the efforts of the Masakan initiative, especially their work on machine translation for scientific research papers to and from African languages. And I feel honored to be in a space like this where like there's a lot of incredible research at this intersection of humanities, digital humanities, machine translation, and NLP is coming out of. And I do feel like in this room, I have a community in which I don't really have to argue for the value of translation work, which is very touching. And this is the project I sort of mention a lot, including Sadilar, to try to bring to fellow historians and others who might not be aware of that. But going back to sort of like the Ottoman context where I'm more embedded, I want to go back to sort of like the criticalness of translation. So I work on a particular, for the most of my research, I work on 18th century manuscript. I will give you more details about that. But this particular manuscript has been translated very recently in 2021, came out in English. And the author of this translation, also a scholar of Ottoman history, Professor Casale, he gave an interview to the university press that published this translation, in which he was asked, why is it so critical to have an English translation of this 18th century Ottoman Turkish memoir? And Casale says that it is, so in terms of the Ottomans and Europe, there's always this expectation that there's a very clear civilizational divide that is dividing Ottomans on one side and Europeans on the other. And this case, this particular translation, when you're reading it, it erases that clarity. So it is no longer quite clear where the Ottoman Empire ends and Europe begins. And this brings me further to my point about translation and about access. And it's about expanding the perspectives of what we can teach in history, expanding the opportunities of whose histories can become a part of the mainstream history writing. And translation, machine translation, could serve to expedite this process of translating, and could aid the scholars in creating first-pass translations and in creating initial starting points out of which we can actually expand what we see as a part of history, as a discipline, but also as a shared human past. And so following these ideas, I conceptualize translation, machine translation, as a part of a two-part solution. So I think there are two contributions that this project makes at the intersection of history research and AI scholarship. The first one is that in the age of AI, current turn of AI, machine translation is no longer a technical problem, but a social one. What do I mean by that? It doesn't mean that all languages are have equally represented, highly resourced translation systems. That would be the dream. It's not there yet. But what it means that for the first time in a long time, the main questions that we're asking from translation are no longer about underlying approaches, matrices, training systems, or models, but it's about data sets. It's about whose languages are in the training data sets, whose languages are built into these massive models. And even if some languages exist, what versions of those languages actually exist in these models that we're interfacing with. And the second argument I make is about the nature of doing AI and AI-driven research, digital and computational research, as a historian and as a humanist. And I argue that the moment that we as historians come in to build the kinds of tools for the research and scholarship that we're interested in, we can have tools that reflect our own perspectives. And historical perspectives are historians working with tools bringing historical perspectives. There are multiple examples of that, but I want to highlight Ruth Mostern and her colleagues' work coming out of University of Pittsburgh, the World Historical Gazetteer. And their work has led to thinking about places and place names and multiplicity of meanings associated with a place that moved beyond the limitations of geographical information systems and technologies related to geographical informations and coordinates. So I would like to place this work in this broader framework of us as digital historians, digital humanists, making tools for our research that challenges the way that technologies work. So I will briefly show you an example of what I mean with the second argument. I've been working towards both training a translation model of my own and using the GPT-4o APIs to create a translation model to create a translation system that is more reliable than off-the-shelf interactions with these models. But I will not go into that for this purpose of the talk, although I'm happy to take questions about that tangent of my research. Instead, I will focus more on the first point that I've emphasized about how translation is at this point more of a social problem. And I argue that like historical data sources actually bring in new perspectives on the social turn that no other data source can. So in very like sort of broad terms, when these models are being tested, they're often being tested on synthetic data, on very limited data sets, and on like often like fictional data sets. Historical data and historical sources, on the other hand, are actual human artifacts. They reflect the real life and the lived experiences of humans and what they have left behind. And these data sets are inevitably closer to understanding what like contemporary real life cases of these models could be. And here I brought you some examples of translation at the intersection of like Ottoman studies and translation. These are all scholarly translations done by, well, they're all also from the early modern field. My training is in the 18th century primarily, so I brought you early modern examples. And here, oh yeah, okay, there. And yeah, so the particular work that I'm talking about is on this manuscript that you see on the right-hand side, The Prisoner of the Infidels, translated by Giancarlo Casale. And I prepared a few slides that are introducing some broader concepts broader practices of Ottoman studies and historical scholarship. I will briefly go over these, but I'm happy to take more questions in the Q&A. And so this is a photo of the original manuscript of the Osman Agha manuscript that I use at the center of my research project. And here is its transcription, meaning that it went from handwritten Arabic script Ottoman Turkish text into a typeset machine readable one. A transliteration is an adaptation of that Arabic script Ottoman Turkish text into Latin script using often specialized transcription alphabets. And an adaptation into modern Turkish is a significant enough translation of the language from the original Ottoman Turkish, such that even though this is legible to someone who can read Turkish, it's not necessarily directly understandable because of the way that the language has evolved over the last 100 years. And then, of course, the case of translation. So for this particular work of Osman Agha, the 18th century manuscript, its first translation into a European language was a German translation in 1954. And later there's a French translation. And like I mentioned, there's an English translation from 2021. So I would like to sort of bring you back to the year 1954. It is actually quite an interesting year in which the two tangents of my research, the studies of machine translation and Ottoman Turkish, come together just by virtue of the fact that the first translation of this work that I'm interested in was from 1954. And also the January 1954 is the headline you see from the New York Times, January 8th. It was the year in which the very first demonstration of a successful use of a machine to translate meaningful texts from one language to another, took place at the IBM and Georgetown demonstration. So I would like to use this year as a way to illustrate how these stories actually converged, but at the same time how they diverged from one another. Because 70 years later, we actually have translation systems that work on Russian, but we don't really have translation systems that work on Ottoman Turkish. And what this says is actually it highlights the social aspects of translation work. It's about what it is that people wanted to translate, what it is that people wanted to invest in translating. And Russian, obviously being a part of the Cold War tangent, was a language that was chosen at the time. Which actually brings me to my next point about low resource languages. Low resource is not a value of the language, but is a sign of how much the scholarly community, the technical community, the broader sort of the communities of technology have chosen to invest in that language. So, and Ottoman Turkish is a dead historical language, but on top of that is a low resource language, meaning that there is really no data sets and no models that work for, like NLP models that work for Ottoman Turkish. But one of the things that scholars have realized in the last sort of like 5 years or so is that large language models can be used to bridge the gap of resourcedness. And here is an example from the, it's been little over a year from the release of the Gemini 1.5 Pro, and how even Google itself, Jeff Dean, the chief research scientist at Google, is actually proposing that Gemini could be used as a machine translation system, especially in the case of this very specific low resource language that barely exists on the internet, Kalaman. And so again, I added a few technical slides about differences in translation. I will skip over those for time considerations, but please feel free to ask me any questions about these. And at the same time, large language models are already being deployed for translation services. So here I'm again referring to Google, Vertex AI. On their generative AI online platform, Google is already asking its users to consider using Gemini as a translation system, as opposed to their neural machine translation model, the Google Translate. And this is again one of the sort of example code that they have of building a translation generative model that does translation using the Gemini API. And then there are other third-party apps that loop in various models, not just Gemini, not just ChatGPT, to do translation. So today we find ourselves in this intersection of, on one hand, we have the languages that are not very well represented in the broader tech community, or in digital scholarship. And at the same time, we have the possibility of doing work with these languages using large language models. And concurrently, what's happening is that as these large language models get more and more successful in various tasks, they're being also deployed in various tasks, with the caveat that they might actually not be the most suitable, hence the question mark in my title. And which brings me back to one of the two main arguments that I'm making in my research. It is that by using historical texts, we're actually not only contributing to history research and the translation of historical works, but we're contributing to our understanding of this particular moment in which large language models are becoming increasingly a part of the machine translation networks that we're seeing. So for this part of my presentation, I will talk about Osman Agha, the manuscript that I've introduced earlier, and the research that I've conducted using this manuscript and translating this manuscript with Gemini 1.5 model. And Osman Agha, the prisoner of the Infidels, this is the English translation of the title. He was an Ottoman soldier who became a prisoner of war towards the end of so it was the beginning of what is currently known as the Great Turkish Wars between 1683 and 1699. So he was from what is modern-day Romania, Timișoara, and he ended up in Austria for about 11 years. And at the end of the war, he escaped his imprisonment in Vienna and returned to the Ottoman lands, and also narrated his account of his times in this manuscript. So this manuscript, as you would expect, comes out of a context in which it's the experiences of one soldier who has survived warfare and imprisonment. So it contains language that one might expect, like accounts of warfare, but it doesn't necessarily contain any gory language or on purpose sort of aggravated language around assault. So I've created 2 data sets to test the particular translation functionality of Gemini. In one of these training data sets, I use the Ottoman transliteration, the version in Latin script, and the English translation. And I created parallel data. Parallel data here means that since we have a full text translation of the text, a transcription of the Ottoman Turkish, and a full text of the English, we essentially have multiple thousand sentences of translation, but then they have to be aligned, because there are like about 1,000, a little over 1,000 sentences in the Ottoman transliteration, and over 2,100 sentences in the English translation, so it's not a one-to-one match. So I use the sentence alignment algorithm to align these, to create a parallel data set in which the sentences are aligned at based on semantic similarity, which created this parallel data set. And I employed the same mechanism to align the English translation, as a comparative data set to understand that to narrow down that the behavior of this model that I will be presenting is actually due to the contents of the text, and it's not because Ottoman Turkish is a low resource language. So the similarities between the behavior in German to English translation and Ottoman Turkish to English translation actually highlight and underscore the fact that what I'm observing is due to the contents of the text. And so what I've particularly tested were these 4 categories that are described as AI safety categories by Google in the Gemini model. So this is obviously a very specific example of how this works, but this is actually an example that is of a certain moment, of the present moment of these of how these AI large language models are being deployed. So we've seen that like recently in the discussions with the DeepSeek model, how people are searching for like information related to Taiwan, and then the model like refuses to give an answer, right? So, I have examples of this from even Duolingo, where like someone is talking to the Duolingo AI model and is asking like, I need to use the bathroom in Spanish, and the model like stops responding. So you have these layers that between the user and the prompt that actually gets processed in the system that check the prompt for various remarks of safety. So this is like GitHub has that with the Copilot, their responsible AI initiative. So these are not necessarily AI models, but they're not necessarily large language models decisions, but it's more so that there's an evaluation and a classification, like an analysis of the contents of the prompt that you're sending, that determines whether or not the prompt is going to be processed by the AI model. And this to me is more in line with content moderation than it is with like AI safety, as like jailbreaking or like trying to hack and like leak the various sort of content that this model has processed. So I want to narrow down my definition of what I mean with AI safety. In this particular context, I'm referring to how these prompts are being moderated. But then these are still like advertised as an AI safety category, and there's very little data and very little like clarity about how these models have these like sort of decisions are being made about what is safe and what is not safe. But in the very specific case of Gemini that I've studied, there are 4 categories: hate speech, dangerous content, harassment, and sexually explicit content. And there are 2 measures on each category. It is a measure of there's a measure of severity of how severe either one of the 4 offenses is, and the probability of the model's like its own evaluation of its certainty, probability of the assignment being true. And here is an example I want to walk you through. This was the input sentence. So in each instance, the prompt was translate the sentence into English, and then the sentence itself appeared. And it was a sentence by sentence using the parallel data set. So for each sentence that went in, there was a ground truth translation, which I've acquired from the scholarly translation. And I evaluated the model outputs based on these ground truth translations. And this particular prompt was not translated, and it was blocked for harassment and for hate speech. So a sentence could be blocked for one or many of these 4 categories. And in this case, it's 2 of them that resulted in this block. And so I ran the whole work through the API calls, sentence by sentence, asked for a translation of it. And I did that twice. I ran the entire work once, and then I picked those sentences that were not translated in the first pass and ran them again. So all of these sentences that appeared here in this list for various block reasons have actually been through this pipeline twice. And they were blocked for either individual of these categories or combinations of these categories. And as you can see, the block tendencies are quite similar, both for Ottoman Turkish and for German. And also, like, I mean, of course, there are fewer data points in the Ottoman Turkish one because there are fewer parallel sentences because the sentences in Ottoman Turkish are longer than in this German translation. So we end up with fewer sentences. But still, the distribution of various categories across the entirety of the work is like the distribution of different categories across all of the sentences that were flagged is quite similar. And yes, and then I will, and I want to walk you through some of these examples in more detail. Here is a very curious example. This is a sentence that was not translated. And I've tried as a scholar of Ottoman Turkish to identify what might be the reason why this got blocked. So, okay, this is, and then I've like, I have the potentially sort of threatening sort of words in bold. So here we're talking about like physical violence. Here we're talking about shackles, and here actually is a curious word. So kerhane in its modern Turkish understanding actually refers to a place of sex work. For the Ottomans, kerhane is actually a place of work, more general, like more similar to its Persian origin. And here, blacksmith's workshop is actually like it's an accurate translation, but it's also like the blacksmith is also like here in the text. And Gemini did not translate this, well, did not get to process this, citing reasons of sexually explicit content. But when you shut down the safety settings, what you see is that actually you end up having some kind of a model output, and then even the word forge, which was previously not understood by the model, actually appears correctly translated. So there is a lot of talk about how the vast context that these large language models have seen results in them having a broader understanding of the nuances of the text. In a way, what we see here is that whatever it was that was blocking the sentence from being translated was not context sensitive enough to actually understand that this word was a historical term in reference to a workshop, and instead marked it as sexually explicit. Whereas once this actually gets processed by the model itself after turning the safety settings off, you actually end up with an output that is reasonable. So this is like a crucial distinction, because just because the models can do it, the technical problem, doesn't mean that they're allowed to do it at every instance. Here is another example that talks about actually something that is sad, but something at the end of the day is a part of warfare that also was not translated by the model. But after the safety settings were turned off, again, there was a possible translation output. And here's an example that like pertains to the more like the discussion of what it is that is determined to be sexually explicit for these safety content moderation settings. So here the reference, the conversation is about a woman who has been sexually assaulted and who's afraid of being pregnant. And what's happening is that Osman, in this instance, is telling that like you've assaulted her essentially, and she's afraid of this. And this sentence was deemed sexually explicit and not translated. And I think it speaks to a broader sort of tendency about these tech companies making decisions along the lines of I'd rather not be seen translating or like producing my model producing something that may be offensive, but then I don't mind that like something that is actually not offensive not being translated. So there's this trade-off that is happening with these safety systems that in-depth historical examples show us, especially because these are actually examples that might as well occur in today's statements. So one of the main points I wanted to make was, One of the main points I wanted to make about this more broadly is that these like sentences so far that you've seen are not necessarily that much different than, of course, they're in Ottoman Turkish, but content-wise, they're not that much different than what you would see today when you're like collecting testimonies from people who are like victims of warfare or personal violence or like any other sort of difficult circumstances. And if the goal of translation was to actually increase access and to make the stories of peoples visible, uh, the ways in which these safety settings are being imposed upon models, while they're still being used and actively like sort of encouraged to be used for translation purposes, it creates this condition where there's the silencing of certain stories based on what corporate policy is at place. And this tension is quite crucial to understanding the broader tendencies in the tech world of today. I think this is exemplary of what a lot of companies like would prefer to miss out on and then not risk being not risk consequences the other way. But then this also in and of itself, this is not a solution is not like silencing content. And one of the things that so this sentence remained, this is a very like sad sentence, but it remained untranslated even with the safety settings off. I don't really have a great interpretation as to why that happened. This sentence, on the other hand, I have a very good interpretation of why that might be. So it's describing a advances of someone, Margot, who is supposed to be a 15-year-old woman on Osman Agha, and this was not translated even with the safety settings off, and it was only translated after I turned the 15 years old, like the age to like something that was no longer a minor, thankfully so. So okay, so this is a bit of it's after midnight, so it's like kind of like I don't want to end on the sad point. I want to instead end on like on the sentiment that these large language models actually have the potential to be used for translation of low resource languages. But the issues that we have with these models, of course, the questions of reliability, questions of consistency, questions of like saying I don't know when they actually don't know whatever something is that they're asked of is one part of that discussion. But another crucial part of that discussion is that they're engineering decisions and project management decisions that are between the user prompts and the models. And while these are in and of itself valuable like things that are preventing different activities from happening, at the same time, the decisions that went into creating these filters, these content moderation systems, have not considered a certain subset of people. And I believe that by looking at historical data and by looking at historical sources, we can actually like think more deeply about the implications of these decisions and have a more focused, a grounding sense of these processes. So yeah, thank you for listening, and I'm open and happy for your questions and feedback.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for a really nice presentation. I apologize for all the bling bling sounds of people coming in and going out. That these settings were turned off, but there was some hidden setting that I didn't find, and during your presentation I managed to find it. So at some point it became quiet. But thank you so much for the presentation.
Yeah.
I don't see any questions at the moment in the chat. I'm not sure if people have no questions. I can hardly believe that. Mace has a question. You can also talk. I think we're at the friendly crowd. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you so much. First of all, thank you for giving such an insightful and brief but like to the point lecture so late at night. Very impressive.
Thank you.
I at first I was a little wondering about how big of an issue is it, but at the end it certainly seems like it's going to impact research to use these techniques blindly. My question is this: when including historical data into large language models, what is kind of the methodology you recommend? Would you just start from maybe like an open source language model and then add historical data to it, and how much of that would you then need?
So I think it depends on what it is, what the task at hand is. So for translation, for training my own machine translation model for Ottoman Turkish, I actually started with a Hugging Face model, a Helsinki NLP's model of modern Turkish into English translation, and I fine-tuned it on a corpus of Turkish novels with English translations to bring the content, because most of the like contemporary data sets are actually coming out of the internet, Wikipedia, various like large news corpora, and the language of those is a little bit different than the than what we see in Ottoman Turkish text. So I try to like bring the domain more similar. So if it's a task that like where there's a room for nudging a little bit, and where you have some resources, because it was relatively easy to like gather a corpus of Turkish English like novels and translations, I suggest doing that. But another task I was interested in is lemmatization, which is a more of a syntax-based task of like finding the dictionary version of a word. For that, I didn't really have any data sets, and hand compiling data sets has been, well, I've worked on that, but there's only some. At one point, my mom was editing the OCR outputs from a text, so like we could edit them more in a more efficient way. And then I'd also experimented with a sort of like an approach to lemmatization using Roberta from 2019. I like reproduced their model. And then, but at that point, like doing all of that work was a lot of sort of like effort, and actually just plugging things in GPT-4 gave very similar results. And so that at that point it becomes a trade-off. Like for like if I were to like revisit this task of lemmatization, if time allows, within the next couple of years, I would probably I would probably experiment with different approaches, but then also I could resort to like API calls off the bat, to be honest.
Okay, thank you. I have more questions, but I also saw one in the chat. I'll be back later, maybe.
We'll keep that in mind. I see a question in the chat. Colleen, do you want to just ask it, or do you want me to read it aloud?
Yeah, thanks, Merve. Am I audible?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Thanks so much. Thank you. This is super interesting. As a translation scholar myself, or study scholar myself, I'm always looking to find new ways of doing things, right? So I was wondering whether you saw any sort of links between what your findings were and whether you compared that to a systemic functional linguistics type of analysis or a cognitive linguistics analysis, just for interest, like to compare what you found.
Thank you so much. I have to be very honest with you. I am not very familiar with the comparative analysis that you're describing. My background isn't necessarily from linguistics, but from like history. And through this research project, I've understood, like also working with linguists, that like there is a whole body of literature on translation that comes out of these fields that I'm not entirely familiar with, but I would love to maybe chat with you further, either over email or over Zoom.
I think you'll
later.
find interesting things. So we can, because if you look at what you found in terms of your methodology, and you can compare it with a systemic functional linguistics analyses, I think the comparison would be very interesting to you. Okay, so thank you.
Definitely, thank you. I will, if you could chat me or email, that would be amazing. So we could be, or like just send me an email, we could stay in touch. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. We were talking just before the presentation started about something small kind of growing into something big, and I feel like something like that is happening now.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, amazing.
Till, I think you are next. You have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you very much, Merve. It was a fantastic talk, particularly given that it was delivered in the middle of the night. Thank you. I have a very specific question regarding your main point of how to classify or measure the extent of veracity as opposed to censorship. And these are not great terms that I'm using, but the ones that come to my mind. Because I would assume that they're more relevant for less resourced languages, right? The mistranslation, if you will, becomes a bigger issue for less resourced languages. And thus, I would assume is sort of the nuanced, minuscule interventions of the model into the translations become more dominant. And then how to use that at scale. And what do I do if a colleague wants to use the translation at scale? And is there something, could you put a number, and say like, with a, whatever, degree of 10%, it's a true translation here?
The accuracy of translation. So I have, like, specifically in this case, what I have seen at scale is that, like, so the numerical results of, like, what you get, the blue scores or the CHRF scores, they're not very high with Ottoman Turkish. So, like, regardless of what model you use, like Gemini seems to perform better than the rest of the large language model. Anything that I have trained only really comes close to these models once I sort of, like, Gemini 1 was like, I felt like I could catch up with it, but like anything like GPT-4 and up isn't really, so in terms of like how good a translation isn't there. But how I see it is that the translation that you get is on average, and that's the thing, it becomes less and less scalable with these really large, with these like low resource languages. So if you put like maybe up, like, so I'm still running some analysis on the how many texts should go in at once. And a heuristic would be, like, based on Ottoman Turkish research, like this may not be scalable, is that if you have one sentence, and then if you keep adding, let's say you send in one sentence for translation, and then you send in 2 sentences for translation that are next to one another, like in the order of the text, like 3, 4, 5, 6. So up until like about 10 sentences or so, you still have an increase in the numerical results, the quality of the translations. And afterwards, it plateaus and actually starts decreasing, because after a certain point, after like about 15 sentence chunks, the model just stops translating and instead starts summarizing. And I think it has to do with the transformer. So I would suggest, as a sort of really, because I know you also work with like Arabic documents, so like what I would suggest is really putting in maybe 7, 8 sentence chunks, depending on how long your sentences are. Mine are like relatively long. And then trying to see how good the quality is, and then playing around with different lengths. And ideally, like, using the API calls. So that's like one of the things, like interacting with these models in chat format, like whether the Gemini, like through the system, or like the ChatGPT form of ChatGPT, doesn't even come close to, like, in quality, doesn't come close to actually like the API calls.
Thank you very much. If I may have a follow-up very briefly. Do you use overlapping chunks? Because you could use that to validate the translation if you have rolling overlap.
I experimented with overlap for segmentation and like alignment across like search sentences. But for translation, I haven't really tested that more robustly, because I kind of went into like thinking more of the what are some sentences, some like words in those sentences that could be triggering with different safety settings. So like currently most of my time in this particular tangent is going into that. Overlapping, it could be interesting, but I would have to come up with a way to actually evaluate that more efficiently. Like, because it has to be like the scores somehow should pertain to what is at the overlap as opposed to the rest of it. But then, yeah, I'm happy to like idea a little bit more with you if you have because I feel like we could together come up with something that is more feasible for understanding the overlap and the impact of the overlap as opposed to the impact of that being in that particular text section. Yeah.
Thank you very much. All the best.
Thank you.
Well, thanks. In the meantime, we've collected a few more questions. I hope we still have enough time. Manana, you're next. Do you want to open your mic?
Thank you very much, and thank you so much for the presentation. My question was based on, putting in information before, whether if you put any translation that you want to see the output, would it just take it, or it needs to be a data that is perhaps put prior to that one in order to process it. Or you can work with any translation or any text, and then you'll still get the same outcome.
So I think it depends on, like, if you train your own translation model, ideally your goal is to sort of train a model that translates the language in its like broadest sort of like capacity. There's also often there are also models that like specifically want to translate scientific text. So with the model that I have trained, I have a test set, and Osman Agha is the center of my test set because this is the hardest in terms of the oldest language, like, and the hardest sort of like language text that I have in my specific corpus aligned with English. And then sort of like I'm never letting my models, when I train them, see this data set, and instead using this entirely as a test case to see actually one of the things I tested along in the scope of this project was to fine-tune a translation model with a couple of Ottoman Turkish novels alongside like the Turkish novels to see if that multilingual approach would get the model to perform better on this particular manuscript. I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but like, yeah, the goal is for it to be able to translate outside of what I've seen in the training.
Okay, let's assume that's a yes. Thank you for that. Salamine, you're next.
Thank you. I don't necessarily have a question. I just wanted to say thank you for the presentation, because what it really sensitized me to is the safety settings in your artificial intelligence, because I specifically work with the translation of statistical documents. For example, we have documents that relate to crime statistics. And I mean, that is chock full of sensitive information that will most likely get flagged. So this was something I hadn't actually considered before. So thank you very much.
No, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, it is really like, I feel like a lot of people, I've been talking about this for almost a year, and a lot of people haven't really realized this until the whole DeepSeek moment a couple of weeks ago, when they realized suddenly that there's this Chinese company that is putting these censorship on AI models, when like everybody has been doing the same thing for like ages, like ages in AI history, you know? But yeah, and another thing that I've seen with that might be like interesting is that sometimes if it's not able to translate something, and it's still like the model, these large language models still keep producing text, and sometimes it like sees like the word crime, and then it's actually often racialized in these large language models. So it's sort of like the data that it has seen in this training, you know, like the contents of these data sets actually take over, and it starts translating things, but it's actually like making things up based on what is the next most probable word, essentially, and that ends up going into a direction, especially in sensitive topics. Like I've seen that specifically related to slavery and translation of documents related to slavery, where it sort of starts inventing things, which that skill of invention hasn't happened in my documents. So, but just, you know, as a quick FYI. I don't know.
Cool, thank you so much. Mace, you had another question? This is actually a question I had as well.
Relates to the availability of historical data sets. And we are also working a lot with trying to find sort of historical data to include in large language models, but what we run into is that OCR quality is very poor. And that completely kind of throws off then we're back in the like technical discussions of translation.
Yeah, I know.
Thought we transcended now, but so do you have any tips for researchers looking for high quality historical data?
I think it depends on the language a lot. Like if you're working with Ottoman Turkish doesn't really have a reliable OCR for handwritten materials. There's incredible research coming out of like communities, especially like NYU Abu Dhabi, Stupan Kırmızıaltın and David Rinsley, who are like here in this talk. Like there's research coming out of for printed Ottoman, but not for like handwritten, same scale. I would say with OCR, like experimenting with TR-OCR is always an option. I think TR-OCR, like it's been like over 5 years, is still like a very interesting system, and especially it scales up well if you have enough like data of the language itself, because it relies on the existence of a large language model as an encoder, as a decoder of the text. And if it's a language, say like French or like Dutch, you might end up with like a more reliable output because you have like, you know, like Camembert, like at least for the French model. I'm not that familiar for like Dutch models, but there's some availability that I think could help. But then, you know, like it's really a I was participating in a research workshop this past week coming out of Monica Lam at Stanford, her lab, Worldwide Knowledge Project. They have had some success with the African Times and the OCR using Azure as the layout analysis system. I'm happy to, like, if you'll email me, I'm happy to send you like some more details about that particular workshop. It was like last Thursday, so I don't have it all down exactly.
And thanks so much. I'll send you a little email.
Great.
Again,
Great.
Herculean task doing all of this at what is now 2 a.m. for you, I believe.
Almost 1, yeah.
Oh, thanks so much.
Okay, thanks. I realize we're kind of running out of time. I'm fine with staying a few more minutes.
Me too, yeah.
To say if you're still fine with that.
Yeah, of course.
Kadir, you had the next question.
Yeah, I wrote it on the chat screen, but thanks for this great study. Actually, I think offers a model for other translations as well. And the issue with alignment of the large language models is an issue. It's clearly visible from your study. Many thanks for that. I have 2 questions actually, and the first one is regarding alignment, which is a sentence based alignment, which is a real issue. And you told that you created an algorithm for that. Would you explain it a bit? And my second question is, as in the example of Kerane, historical distance is a great issue in translation. And what was your solution to it? Did you add annotations, explications, or did you add more sentences to your data so that those historically distant words could be understood by the model? And many thanks again.
So thank you for the question. So with sentence alignment, that's actually another thing that I cut out of this talk, because it's in and of itself like at least an hour talk. I find sentence alignment super fascinating. I'm sending 2 ACL paper links in the chat for everyone. So I actually used a sentence alignment system, SentAlign, very recently. It's from 2023, I think, and it relies on the LAPC sentence embeddings, which are a particular kind of multilingual embeddings, and it aligns the sort of like it encodes both of the text using the same embeddings in an embedding space that actually sort of has a specific eye towards creating translation and bringing sentences that are semantically closer to one another, as opposed to like just usually often what happens in multilingual large language models is that like the languages start clustering along different axes of the embedding space. So I experimented both with VecAlign and with SentAlign, and like both of the papers I send, VecAlign actually performed better for modern Turkish and for German than SentAlign, if only after I got like VecAlign to work through LAPC embeddings instead of the laser embeddings that it's originally built for. I definitely recommend looking into both of those. I'm happy to I think my code is on my GitHub probably for how I got the VecAlign to run with LAPC instead of with laser. And with the historical translation, so this particular example, so the way to go is to actually have more examples. So like essentially, if there were more translations of Ottoman Turkish that could be brought in, like that would be like the solution. I haven't used any, so there are different sort of like ways of approaching this problem of how do we nudge the models in a specific direction. But one of the things that I really sort of value is one of the purpose of this unsupervised, this unlabeled data turn of like as in the deep learning turn as well of the last 20 years is really showing us that some of these rule-based systems have not performed the same way as just being able to scale up data. And I have seen myself like a higher performance through just being able to scale up the sources, like an increase in the performance. So and yeah, and particularly with the Kerhane, that problem is actually like somewhat solved with Gemini once you can access the model. So that was one of the points I was trying to make. Like these large language models have actually like enough context awareness, probably because they have consumed the whole internet, that works to some extent. But also to that point, like, and I think it ties to what I was trying to tell to Till's question as well. These are maybe never going to be at 100%. So maybe it's okay that it's at 90% and then you edit the rest yourself, and you, as in this case, me. Like if I could get like the corpus that I'm working on ready about 90% accuracy and I could do the rest by hand, and it would take me, like a year instead of 7. So like in rough estimates. So
Cool, thanks. I think we have one question left. Laura?
Hello.
Mhm.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to enable my, thank you very much. And really amazed by, being happy so late anyway, and being so efficient anyway. So well done. I was curious again about the idea of alignment and sentences. In translation studies, the idea of identifying a translation unit has been there for centuries. Like, where do we start from? Clearly, word is not good enough, but above and beyond word is complex. But, sentence, especially when languages are so distant, the relatedness of languages is so far apart, it becomes further complicated. And I do see the question at the beginning about systemic functional linguistics, because we start discussing sentences and we unpack in phrases and clauses, and we identify the lexical verb, etc. So we kind of get into unpacking the complexity, but at the same time understanding the must say, as Jacobson would say, and the may say of each language. So the grammar, syntax, sort of diversity and mismatch is somehow covered in understanding, to what extent a language has to say something or cannot say something because it's not necessary by grammar rules, etc. So the sentence alignment is very interesting, but at the same time, I feel like it's a very good start, but eventually it's kind of, potentially defeating the objective if translation is the objective, because how do you know how much is cut out, not because of, the safety, but because of misunderstanding in the syntax or misunderstanding in how much information is considered redundant in one language or in the other. Just to give you a very simple example, in English and in Italian, I'm Italian, the subject is an issue, because in Italian we have inflection, so all verbs, we can start any sentence with a verb. And we can also attach, change the verb morphological for gender, number, etc., and tense. And so one word will actually cover a massive amount of information. On the other hand, you need to unpack that in English. You need to have always and repeat always this subject. So that's my worry, and I wonder whether you've been thinking about sort of a stage 2 and parsing the text at a more finer, sort of sophisticated splitting and splitting them into sort of smaller unit. So I wonder whether you've been considering that.
Of course. No, thank you for the question, because I agree. And also what you lose in Ottoman Turkish, like my main issue with sentence has been that there is no grammatical gender in Ottoman Turkish. So what ends up happening is when you're translating into English, which actually was also like the big thing in 2016, Google Translate neural model, you would have a sentence in Turkish that would be, say, like he, she, it, they is whatever. And then that single word in Turkish, but then the Google Translate would make a decision if it's so engineer afterwards, it would end up being he is an engineer. Teacher afterwards, it would end up being she's a teacher. So like this is definitely an issue that has been like in my mind, and particularly like also sort of in this tangent, it becomes a like with this particular language of Ottoman, it's an issue that cannot be avoided. The reason for sentence is because sentence is the field standard in machine translation research. So the data sets that are produced, including the Helsinki NLP data set, they're all aligned at sentence level. So there were attempts of doing like word alignment, like word-to-word translation, coming from like the actually early 50s, like the initial like mechanical translation research. They try to do some really fascinating stuff, MIT, UCLA, about like German and translating like sort of having like a dictionary of like word-to-word translation. A lot of more fine semantic analysis is not possible at scale with Ottoman Turkish because we just don't have the tools. Like even lemmatization is like, lemmatization is, it's not that it's a simple task, but it's like a more straightforward task than a lot of like higher level dependency parsing. Like for a proper UD dependency parsing, you need a proper UD dependency parsing data set that has been created by groups of scholars, like, various like annotation agreement and stuff like that. So yeah, annotation agreement in this research is mostly me agreeing with me. So it's not like so I think a lot of it is quite interesting. And the main reason I haven't experimented with anything shorter than a sentence is because I just don't have the resources. Like, yeah, that's like the main issue. But I've tried scaling up to see how what more sentences would do. But then that's not exactly like, so I definitely like thank you for like sharing the insights from the Italian example. I'm hoping like if I were to ever have an actual research lab as faculty somewhere, maybe, like energies, putting energies out there.
Yeah,
like
sure.
definitely, it's really curious. Like
no, because sorry, just adding on
course,
what you said about gender, because that's the other big issue, the other big debated topic about large language models, that they are biased, so they play on stereotypes, and so an engineer is always a male, whereas a teacher is always a female, as much as a nurse is a female and a doctor is a male, and this is kind of across cultures, and even where cultures have been dynamic enough to actually not understand such stereotypical idea of profession in place anymore. But yes, okay, thank you very much. Yeah, I do see.
Thank you.
Well, I might keep in touch. Really amazing your work.
Especially if you know of anyone interested in doing more, like lemmatization was my first like interest in actually like this like NLP and the syntax and like linguistics more broadly, like so, but I haven't really been able to find the same level of resources and support as a PhD student at the end of the day to like actually take on a project of that scale where I would be like spending a lot of time alongside the other research requirements I have.
Right. Fab, thank you very much. Have you published anything yet out of this work?
So this is going to be my master's thesis, so I'm still writing the thesis itself. I have mostly talks. I've submitted one paper to an NLP conference. I will know by the end of the month, I think, whether my paper got in. It's the so it's like the SIG, humanities SIG of the ACL, like American Association of Computational Linguistics, the North American branch.
Okay.
But yeah, I will hopefully the thesis by the end of the year will be out, like with both parts together, both my own model and the research on Gemini.
Wow. Well, good luck with everything, and I'll keep in touch. Thank you very much.
Of course, thank you.
Well, thank you. I realize we're kind of running. Well, I'm not really running out of time, but I really don't want to keep you awake for too long. I just quickly see one comment from Till. So this was about the accuracy part and the gain of time. So you then need to find the 10%. But that's really, I think, something for future work as well.
And it changes what your intention is. So like for me, I when I was teaching my own course a couple of years ago, I translated one of the newsletters that I work on for my own students. And like that took me several hours, like because it's difficult. But like if I had a system like this, maybe I could do it in an hour. So I'm really thinking of the very small scale at first as potentially where we could have a manual intervention, like at the scale of some of the books that I've shown, like the Social History Reader that came out from Chicago. Like we can do that kind of work. We can scale that up more efficiently at first, but I don't have a very good answer for a very large corpus. At that point, I think 10% is it's also something that people often accept in OCR. So I think it really depends on your corpus and on what it is that you're doing with that corpus.
Okay. Hey, thank you so much.
Of course.
I think people found this. I mean, I found it very interesting. I think I'm not the only one seeing the discussion. But thank you again, and thank you very much for staying up so late.
I'm happy to, and thank you everyone for all of your amazing comments. Like, I'm so happy to be like a part of this community. Feel free to like email me, reach out. I'd love to continue conversations.
Wonderful, thank you.
Thank you, Merve. Bye.